In America, we often say respect is earned, not given. But what happens when it's earned 100 times over and still denied? Lieutenant General Hayes, a 3-star black officer in the U.S. Army, carried over 3 decades of service, countless commendations, and a chest full of medals into a quiet Virginia town. All he wanted was a cheeseburger after a 6-hour drive. But to 2 local officers, what they saw wasn't a decorated military leader. It was just a black man in a nice car. In a parking lot barely lit by flickering sodium lights, that bias became a weapon. They didn't run his tags, didn't check his ID. They judged him on sight. Power, earned through sacrifice, was dismissed with a sneer. "Nice costume," one officer mocked, gripping his holster, as if service stripes were threats. It wasn't just an insult, it was a stripping of humanity, of dignity, of the right to be believed. Hayes remained calm. He didn't yell. He didn't resist. He offered credentials, requested verification. Instead, he was slammed against cold metal, handcuffed, and arrested for impersonating himself. It wasn't until a call to the Pentagon shattered their illusion that they realized who they had brutalized. The truth? This wasn't about protocol, it was about perception. In that moment, rank meant nothing. Medals meant nothing, and service to country couldn't outshine the color of his skin. That's the danger of unchecked bias. It doesn't ask questions, it makes assumptions. And in places like Greystone, Virginia, those assumptions have consequences far beyond bruises or public outrage. They erode the very fabric of justice, because if even a U.S. general can be dehumanized without cause, what hope is there for the everyday black American just trying to get home? In the United States, where uniforms are supposed to symbolize honor and service, appearance still too often overshadows truth. Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes wasn't just any man in dress blues. He was a living testament to discipline, valor, and decades of sacrifice for his country. But to Officers Ramsey and Holt in Greystone, Virginia, none of that mattered. What they saw wasn't the 3 stars on his shoulder or the ribbons marking campaigns most Americans only read about. They saw a black man in a uniform that didn't fit the image they'd been taught to believe. The assumption? He was a fraud, playing dress-up, pretending to be something no black man could be in their minds, powerful, respected, real. Their judgment came swiftly and without investigation. They didn't run his military plates, they didn't check his ID. Instead, they laughed, mocked, and escalated. "That's a hell of a costume," Ramsey said, as if valor could be bought at a costume shop. Their eyes didn't see service, they saw a stereotype. It's a chilling reminder that for some, bias doesn't need proof, it only needs a target. In less than 5 minutes, a man who had led troops into battle and briefed presidents was treated like a criminal because of the skin he was born in. This wasn't about misconduct, it was about misperception. When appearance becomes the lens through which people are judged, dignity is stripped and justice is delayed if not denied altogether. What happened to General Hayes was more than an arrest, it was a mirror held up to a society still tangled in the roots of racial bias. Until we stop seeing through assumptions and start seeing with clarity, stories like his will continue to repeat, and the cost will always be dignity. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need to shout or throw fists. Sometimes it stands tall in silence, like Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes did that night in Greystone, Virginia. When 2 local officers accused him of impersonating a U.S. Army general, cuffed him, and slammed him onto the hood of his rental car, he didn't yell or resist. He didn't let anger take over, though few would have blamed him if he had. Instead, he chose a path forged by decades of military training, personal discipline, and an understanding that real power doesn't panic, it endures. General Hayes understood that losing control would only feed the very narrative they were desperate to project onto him, so he kept his voice calm, his hands visible, and his words precise. He requested that they call Fort Bragg, who gave them a name, Colonel Denise Warren, who could verify his identity. But they didn't listen. They didn't want the truth. What they wanted was submission. But dignity isn't submission. It's choosing principle over pride. Hayes allowed the process to unfold, knowing the truth would eventually catch up to the injustice. And when the phone call to the Pentagon changed everything, When the voice of Secretary Hargrove cut through the smug certainty of those officers, it wasn't just vindication. It was a powerful example of what restraint looks like when the world expects rage. General Hayes didn't walk out of that station defeated. He walked out as a symbol, a reminder that dignity isn't about being passive. It's about being unshakable in the face of ignorance. And in America, where racial bias too often tests the patience of the most honorable, his quiet defiance taught a louder lesson than rage ever could. Real strength is knowing exactly who you are and never letting anyone take that from you. Sometimes, all it takes is one phone call to turn injustice on its head. For Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes, that moment came after enduring humiliation, wrongful arrest, and outright racial profiling in a dimly lit parking lot in Greystone, Virginia. Despite offering identification, remaining calm, and clearly stating his rank, Hayes was handcuffed and thrown into the back of a patrol car, accused of impersonating a role he had rightfully earned over 30 years of military service. But when the officers refused to verify his identity, Hayes delivered a quiet warning: "Call the Pentagon, ask for Secretary Hargrove." They laughed, until the line connected. That phone call, placed from a weathered desk inside a rundown police station, didn't just clear Hayes's name, it shook the entire department to its core. The voice on the other end wasn't just a bureaucrat, it was Secretary Elaine Hargrove, one of the highest-ranking officials in the Department of Defense. And when she learned what had happened, her words hit like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. "Release him, now." In an instant, the tone shifted. The officers' smirks vanished. Their arrogance gave way to panic. That single call exposed what they had tried to cover up with force and assumption: a failure to see the truth. The power of that moment wasn't just in the title Hargrove held, but in the undeniable authority of truth finally being heard. One voice from one phone line was enough to dismantle a false narrative built on prejudice. In America, where systems sometimes fail those they're meant to protect, the right voice at the right time can still break through. And for General Hayes, that call didn't just free him, it reminded the nation that silence can be shattered with one connection and a voice unwilling to back down. What began as a quiet act of racial profiling in a small Virginia town erupted into a national reckoning. The moment video footage of Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes being handcuffed in full uniform hit social media, the internet ignited. Within hours, hashtags like "Justice for Hayes" and "General Tate" were trending across X, TikTok, and Instagram. Millions of Americans watched in disbelief as a decorated black general, his chest heavy with medals, was slammed against a patrol car by officers too blinded by bias to recognize dignity when it stood before them. The footage sparked more than outrage, it sparked action. Reporters descended on Greystone. Protesters filled the streets outside the police station, holding signs that read, "See us, don't cuff us," and "Service deserves respect." Jenny, the waitress who had witnessed the entire arrest, became an unexpected voice for justice, recounting the night's events on national television. Her words, "That man was a gentleman, a soldier. They treated him like dirt because of his skin," resonated far beyond her diner counter. Even conservative networks couldn't spin the facts. This wasn't politics, it was humanity. Community leaders held emergency town halls, veterans groups demanded accountability, the Pentagon launched a formal inquiry, and across America, people began asking the hard questions. If a three-star general could be dehumanized in public, what chance does the average black citizen have? Greystone's police department came under fire. Officers Ramsey and Holt were suspended. The police chief stepped down. Reforms were announced, but more importantly, a conversation that had long simmered beneath the surface exploded into the mainstream. Because justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears hashtags, takes to the streets, and speaks through the voices of everyday people refusing to stay silent. And in that storm, truth found its spotlight, and a community found its voice. What happened to Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes wasn't just a moment, it became a movement. His calm defiance in the face of blatant racial profiling didn't just expose the prejudice of two officers in Greystone, Virginia. It lit the fuse on a much-needed conversation about systemic accountability. Within days, The fallout went far beyond apologies. Officer Ramsey and Officer Holt were suspended, their personnel files reopened, and years of unchecked complaints were finally brought into the light. The police chief resigned. But the most powerful ripple effect wasn't just punishment. It was reform. The town brought in a new police chief from Philadelphia, a no-nonsense woman with a record of community-driven policing. Mandatory bias training was rolled out across the department, a civilian oversight board was established. Schools began incorporating curriculum on civic responsibility and historical contributions of Black Americans, including service members like Hayes. Churches held forums on healing and empathy, and at the heart of it all was a question that now refused to be ignored. What kind of justice system do we want to be part of? Dorian Hayes never asked for the spotlight. He didn't need it. His service, his medals, his integrity, they already spoke volumes. But because he chose to stand tall, to demand dignity instead of vengeance, he became a catalyst for something greater than vindication. He became proof that one man's restraint could move an entire system toward reflection and change. Real change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with a line drawn, a truth spoken, and a refusal to go quietly. And in Greystone, what started as one man's humiliation ended as a town's awakening. Because systems only stay broken when people stop pushing to fix them. Hayes pushed with dignity, and the system had no choice but to shift. Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes never intended to become a symbol. That night in Greystone, Virginia, he just wanted a quiet meal and a peaceful drive before an important military briefing. But the injustice he endured didn't stay in that parking lot. It echoed across the country. His experience wasn't just about him. It resonated with every Black American who's been stopped, questioned, doubted, or dismissed simply because of how they look. What happened to Hayes became a mirror forcing the nation to confront the uncomfortable truth that even honor, rank, and decades of service can be overshadowed by skin color in the eyes of prejudice. As the story spread, so did its impact. Young officers in training academies studied it. Civil rights groups cited it in their campaigns. Teachers used it in classrooms to spark conversations about race, respect, and recognition. Hayes himself, though reluctant to wear the badge of hero, took on a quiet role as mentor, guiding the next generation of Black service members who now knew through him what strength under pressure looks like. This wasn't just one man's victory over two reckless officers. It was a victory for visibility, for truth. For every person who ever felt unseen in a uniform or unvalued in their community, the ripple effects continued: new policies, fresh dialogue, renewed public awareness. In a country where individual actions can seem swallowed by systemic problems, Hayes proved that one man's restraint, integrity, and refusal to back down can shift the narrative. He gave voice to the voiceless, strength to the weary, and most of all, proof that justice, even when delayed, can still shine bright enough to guide others forward. Because dignity doesn't end with one man, it multiplies, and in this case it became a nationwide reminder that change begins when someone stands, even while others try to push them down. For Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes, the road to dignity wasn't just paved with rank and medals. It was built on faith, patience, and a legacy far greater than himself. What happened in Greystone wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But Hayes didn't carry that burden just for himself. He carried it for his father, a Vietnam veteran who returned from war to face hatred at home. He carried it for every young Black cadet watching, wondering if the uniform would protect them or betray them. And he carried it for the next generation, the ones coming up behind him, building their paths on the battles he silently fought. Hayes never responded with rage. Instead, he chose legacy over retaliation. He mentored younger officers. He listened to their fears, reminded them that leadership means knowing when to rise without shouting and when to let truth do the talking. "You don't just keep going," he once told a young lieutenant. "You build the road while you walk it." That's the legacy Dorian Hayes leaves behind, not just as a general, but as a guardian of dignity. His story reminds us that strength isn't in force, but in endurance. that sometimes the greatest victories aren't marked by parades, but by the quiet transformation of a community, a department, even a country. And that legacy lives on, in schools where his name is now part of the curriculum, in precincts undergoing real reform, in the voices of citizens who demand more because one man showed them they could. Faith kept him steady, legacy gave him purpose, and together they ensured that one night in a small-town parking lot would echo far beyond its borders, as a testament to how one man's dignity can become a nation's awakening. What happened in Greystone, Virginia, could have been just another ugly incident, another town that looked the other way, but instead, it became a turning point. After the wrongful arrest of Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes, the town was forced to confront not only the actions of two officers, but the culture that allowed such bias to go unchecked. And while outrage first swept through the streets, what followed was something more powerful. Accountability, reflection, and ultimately, community rebirth. It started with small things. Jenny, the waitress who stood up for General Hayes, became a voice of local truth, live streaming city council meetings and organizing forums in the high school gym. The town appointed a new police chief, a black woman from Philadelphia known for her reform work. Officers underwent bias training, a civilian oversight board was created, and policies were rewritten to focus on transparency and community engagement. But it wasn't just about law enforcement. Churches held conversations about race and forgiveness. Teachers introduced new history materials that honored Black veterans and highlighted systemic injustice. Even local businesses put up signs reading, "We see you, we hear you, we respect you." Change came slowly, but it came from within. The town that once turned a blind eye began to look inward. People talked more, judged less, and began to take ownership of their role in shaping a more just community. And while Dorian Hayes didn't return to Greystone, he didn't need to. The shift he inspired was real, not perfect, but permanent. Community rebirth doesn't happen with slogans, it happens with commitment. Greystone proved that even in the aftermath of shame, a town can rise not by erasing the past, but by learning from it. And in that growth, they honored more than one man. They honored the very idea of justice. Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes walked out of the Greystone police station with his head held high. But the story didn't end at the station door. That moment, caught on video, shared by millions, wasn't a conclusion. It was a spark. What some saw as just another case of racial profiling turned into something far more powerful, the beginning of a movement, the birth of a new conversation, and a call to action that couldn't be ignored. For Hayes, the ordeal wasn't a personal defeat, it was an opportunity to show what grace under pressure truly looks like. And while the bruises would heal and the cuffs were long gone, what remained was a renewed sense of purpose, not just for him, but for the country watching. His story became a catalyst for change in small towns and big cities alike. It empowered others, service members, young Black men, everyday citizens, to speak up, to push back, and to believe that dignity doesn't disappear under pressure, it rises. The aftermath didn't fade, it evolved. Departments reformed, communities listened, and a new generation of leaders stepped forward, inspired by a man who refused to be broken. Hayes didn't need revenge, he had resolve, and that resolve rippled into classrooms, policy discussions, and late-night conversations between parents and their kids about what justice should really look like. So no, that night in Greystone wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger, something braver, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories don't end with applause or justice served. They end with doors opening, with minds changing, and with a nation slowly waking up. Because when dignity stands tall in the face of injustice, it doesn't just survive, it leads the way forward. In life, dignity is often tested in the quiet moments when no one expects us to stand tall. The story of Lieutenant General Dorian Hayes is a powerful reminder that even in the face of humiliation and injustice, composure and truth can carry more weight than anger.